I sometimes lean towards that theory as being the most likely to carry with it all the varying details that we have. That or something like it must have been what happened, that he wasn't in the car, she went off. What I can't figure out though is what would make him put himself as the driver. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you are new, then welcome. We are working through Chappaquiddick by Leo Damore. It's the story of the power, privilege, and the Ted Kennedy cover-up that happened in the summer of 1969, where Ted Kennedy's car went off a bridge on the island of Chappaquiddick in Massachusetts. And Mary Jo Kopechne was inside, and it claimed her life. And so we have walked through the investigation of the actual wreck itself. We have heard Ted Kennedy's admission and all of the holes therein, all of the lack of detail and the oddities about that statement that was made at the police chief's office. We have seen the way that the Ted Kennedy compound gathered to itself all of the JFK and RFK, men who had worked on their campaigns, men who had been speechwriters and advisors and lawyers. They all gathered at Hyannisport and walked Ted through what he should and shouldn't say. He was very silent and almost non-participatory in that, has been the general recollection of those who were there and were willing to talk. It seems that no one actually got the story from Ted himself. Joe Gargan was a near witness, and he is a primary source for this book. So a lot of what we are told comes through verification of him, although I will show you guys, we're this far into the book, we're on chapter 36. There is a significant part of the book I'm going to open up and show you guys how big. All of this section, which you can see the thickness of the book, but this whole section right here is all the end notes, and it goes line by line by line, giving verification through various radio interviews and newspaper articles and direct sourcing. So it is a very well-researched book. I say all that to say, hopefully to redraw you in to this investigation. I had someone give input that perhaps we should go a little faster with this book. And so it's my intent to do at least our weekly episodes and possibly 2 each week. So today we're going to start with chapter 36. By way of reminder, what has happened right before this is that Ted Kennedy returned to the Senate floor only to find out that the DA had just decided to reopen the investigation. Totally took him by surprise, and he was said to have blown his top. So that's where we are in the story now. The senator would have no comment on the Diniz letter before a call from Kennedy's office went out to Judge Tarrow in Boston. Tarrow was outraged that the letter had been made public before he received it. It's very bad judgment, at the least on DA Diniz's part, to disclose information of this sort without first notifying the court. Tarrow refused comment until he received the letter, which arrived by special delivery the next morning. He dismissed the request out of hand. No provision of law permitted the Superior Court to conduct inquests, he said, and he scorned Diniz for, quote, the confusion and misconceptions you have created in the minds of many regarding the judicial process. Diniz took Tarrow's rebuke in stride. The law on inquests was ambiguous about jurisdiction. There's discussion about who would do better to deal with an inquest, and so Diniz sends his request to Kenneth Nash, who is the Chief Justice of the District Court. We're told that while district attorneys might request inquests, they are practically obsolete. Kenneth Nash said, all an inquest can do is to recommend to a DA that grand jury action is advisable. So basically, a grand jury would be used to ascertain if a crime happened and that there were parties accused of doing it. An inquest was limited to the question of whether a crime had been committed. The difference was a judge is trained on determining legal causation, and grand juries are not. So Diniz should have filed his request with the presiding judge of the district court at Edgartown. That would be Judge Boyle. Judge Boyle probably would have disqualified himself from presiding at an inquest, having imposed a suspended sentence for Ted Kennedy leaving the scene, and delivered himself of the extrajudicial opinion that Senator Kennedy had been, quote, punished far beyond anything this court can impose. You remember, Judge Boyle was the one who had the 6-minute case that Ted Kennedy showed up to a couple episodes ago. Diniz had not followed the established procedure. And so now Steele, Walter Steele, remember, is the prosecutor. He was willing to sit down and talk rationally with DA Diniz about evidence, but would oppose an inquest, he said, quote, if he had any official standing to do so. Steele did not think a new inquiry would produce any evidence of any crimes. But Chief Arena, remember, he said an inquest could resolve a number of unanswered questions. He was nettled by criticism that his handling of the case might have provoked the demands for this new investigation, and he's sensitive about the fact that, he had failed to question the persons that were present at the party, with the exception of Jack Crimmins. And he makes the statement, here we go, Arena again, he makes the statement that he had interviewed a number of them, and so had Walter Steele. No one at the party to whom Arena talked could pinpoint the exact time that Senator Kennedy and Mary Jo Kopechne had left the party. But later, an embarrassed Arena confessed, maybe we were just trying to cover our asses or something, but that story is inaccurate. We only talked to Jack Crimmins. We never got to the other party people at all. As a first step in the investigation, Diniz ordered the accident car impounded, and Bernie Flynn supervised the removal of the car to the depot corner garage for the state police barracks. Shrouded in tarps up to this point, the car had now been stripped by souvenir seekers of 3 ashtrays, the gas cap and pedal, pieces of a shattered windshield, and chrome trim. So people are just grabbing splinters and any parts that are removable off the car as their own personal souvenirs from this Chappaquiddick accident. Flynn says, Diniz didn't want to go after the case at all. He was so scared of it. He wasn't answering his phone. He was forced by the press baying at his heels to do something. Flynn said, had he been smart, he would have kept his hands off like Killen told him to do. Killen was fit to be tied and mad as hell when he got word of Diniz's letter. In Killen's view, Diniz was upset at the criticism in the press and had caved to pressure. George Killen, you'll remember, is the state police detective lieutenant. He's in charge of the Cape Cod office of the DA. So he works with Diniz, but he was the investigator, and he's mad. He says, this is just criticism. This is just caving into the criticism that had come in from the press. Frank Keating thought that there might be another reason that Diniz went ahead and got involved. He says, one thing about Diniz was there was no hanky-panky with drunk driving cases. He had that scathing attitude about anybody who drank because he never drank himself to any degree. And the press had now been pounding with the accusation that Ted Kennedy must have been drinking at the time of the accident. And so Keating feels that this is needling Diniz into taking action. So Keating starts to watch, well, will this even go to trial? But Jimmy Smith, who you'll remember was a former Kennedy campaign staffer, he's sort of a Kennedy insider, and he's the one who has tried to have calls into the Kennedy compound and that sort of thing. He actually commends Diniz and says that he had been unfairly criticized. It says, Eddie turned sour when he was hammered and ridiculed by the press. He went into a rage and attacked like he usually does, Smith said. So errors of judgment on the part of Ted Kennedy's advisors had been responsible for the reopened investigation. Diniz was amused when Smith told him he didn't want anything to do with the inquest. Diniz said, "We didn't have any plans for you to be involved." With the inquest letter, I was put into a back room, Smith said. They were afraid that I would surface, so they had me tucked away. George Killen is concerned that everybody's going to discover that there's an actual Kennedy connection in the office, and so they're tucking Smith back away, or that's at least what we're being told here. Diniz called off the press conference because reporters were already gathering, and he never releases the statement that he had prepared to read for the press conference. But in his statement, what he had written is that his request was not based on the uncovering of new evidence, like that they had found something new, but rather on the lack of information that would allow me to remain out of the case with a clear conscience. He says the purpose of his action of pursuing an inquest is just to find the truth and to deflect criticism that an inquest had in any way been invited because of the unavailability of witnesses. Quote, 3 young women who had attended the party at Chappaquiddick complained to the New York Times that they had yet to be approached by Massachusetts authorities to even give statements about the accident. So that's pretty humiliating. They're saying, look, we were at the party and we haven't even been asked to give a statement. Senator Kennedy cancels a speech. His press reporter, Dick Drain, says he doesn't feel that now is the time for him to travel to Europe. He wants to be available in case this presence is required now that there's an investigation. And he says, but he doesn't understand why Diniz is asking for an inquest. On the Senate floor, Kennedy himself said, it's rather unclear as to the nature of it. I plan to cooperate in any way. But he had thought that as long as he participated and took responsibility in that court situation, that there wouldn't be any further kind of legal action. So he is completely blindsided by this. Columnists for different papers are saying basically nobody believes Senator Kennedy's explanation for the accident, and that anybody who has an honest sense of things ought to be appalled at kind of the conspiracy of official silence that has surrounded the tragedy. Kennedy's televised explanation, he wrote, was at once self-pitying and unsatisfactory. This is a quote from James Reston, a columnist that was writing about it on an editorial. He said, there is about the whole incident an unpleasant aura of protected privilege. Senator Kennedy and every other witness who will be called to testify must be prepared to give honest answers to the searching questions that remain to be asked. And so reporters are trying to descend on Kennedy, and different people are trying to feel him out and figure out what is happening. Leo Damore does give us a little bit of backstory that's helpful to know about Diniz, this DA who is bringing the accusation against Ted. We are told that he had been elected at age 34 to be the youngest DA in Massachusetts, and that 13 years prior to this time, he had been a delegate to the 1956 Democratic Convention, and he had actually walked up with John F. Kennedy to the rostrum to accept nomination as vice president, and he had wholeheartedly supported his election in 1960. So he had been a Kennedy man. But later, during Ted Kennedy's Senate run, he had stood with the opponent of Ted Kennedy. He had had a previous connection with this man who was running against Ted Kennedy. And because of that, the Kennedy camp decided that Diniz, even though he had supported JFK, couldn't be relied on because he had gone with the opponent rather than standing fast with Ted Kennedy in 1962. And so this is why he was seen as a maverick. Diniz said, I am controversial, and I have been ever since I entered politics 20 years ago. Sometimes I may have been wrong, but at least I have gone along doing what I thought was right. He says the primary duty of the DA's office is not to convict, but to see that justice is done. So, Chapter 36 observations are: legal minds differ as to whether or not an inquest is even suitable in this situation. Steele is opposed to the inquest. Arena feels vulnerable because of the criticism that he's received, and he claims they've interviewed a number of partygoers. The truth is, they only interviewed criminals. Diniz impounds the car and it enters state evidence, but it has already been stripped for souvenirs. Senator Kennedy says he's going to be available. And then we learn about Diniz's former JFK connections and how he became seen as a maverick. Chapter 37. Gargan begins by giving us insight into what Ted is thinking at this point. He says he wasn't surprised that Diniz had asked for a new investigation. Here's his quote: "I wasn't confident at the time that would be the end of the matter." So the court situation where Ted had come down on the boat and gone to the court to plead guilty. He says, "I wasn't confident at the time that would be the end of the matter, particularly with all the publicity the case was getting. The senator's report of the accident had been composed in haste and ill-advised. A week of deliberations at the compound had produced a speech that seemed to contradict many of the things written in the statement. But making unsworn statements to police and delivering a ghost-written exegesis on television was one thing. To repeat them at an inquest would be another. To repudiate either statement would be to admit that he had lied. To repeat lies for the sake of consistency under oath risked perjury. Senator Kennedy would have to tread carefully." Now, interestingly, what I'm seeing in this as we read is that Gargan is admitting not only that there's inconsistency, but he is admitting that there's the risk of perjury, which means he knows inherently somehow, with his insight as to what actually he knew from the night, as well as what's been said and done now, he knows that there's some disconnect there. I'm sure more than we actually are being told here. It had never been anticipated that the senator would be called upon to provide sworn testimony about the accident, a major consideration in his decision to plead guilty to leading the scene. Stephen Smith now took over the direct management of this crisis to deal with the inquest he scorned as an imprecise process devoted primarily to train accident that hasn't been used in Massachusetts since, I don't know, never. Steve Smith came to sort of dominate things after a while, one participant said. He decided the girls should not be left high and dry. He says, we've got to watch out for their interest. And so later he would deny having any part in retaining counsel for the young ladies that had come to the party. But here's Senator Kennedy's explanation. After an inquest was called for, there appeared to be some necessity to retain counsel. I felt they were innocent individuals who, as a result of my action, were being brought into court. I felt some responsibility to at least offer some compensation. Arrangements were made by which I paid their attorneys. So Ted's attorney, Judge Clark, recommends his friend, Daniel Daly, to represent Ray LaRosa, Jack Crimmins, Charles Treader, and the young women of the boiler room. Reportedly, one of the first actions taken was to instruct the women not to discuss the case with reporters or police. So they've just made this statement, nobody's even asked us, but now they're being told don't answer even if you're asked, even by police. Clark was shutting off any other avenues of information. And so on September 11th, Registry Inspector Joseph Grealish confirmed by telephone that the hearing was being postponed. The hearing was pushed back from, I think it was going to be October, to May 6th, 1970 at 10 a.m. This would be more than 10 months after the accident. Registrar McLaughlin had the Chappaquiddick file in a locked drawer in his office to prevent anyone subordinate to him from finding documents and leaking out information. If anybody If the accident had helped anyone with a political windfall, it was this guy, McLaughlin. His term of office was due to expire in December, and he was a holdover appointment from the previous governor, and they were not expected to be renamed by the Republican governor that was now in office. But because he was being very accommodating on the case, he was gathering up leverage to keep his job. The Kennedy political apparatus in Massachusetts would not want a Republican appointee dealing with this sensitive Chappaquiddick case. So he's got himself in this spot where the Kennedy people want him, and by trying to be amenable to the higher ups, he's working to keep his job. In contrast to the week following the accident, there was no rush of Jack Kennedy's men to the compound. Most conspicuously absent was Ted Sorensen. Remember, this is the speechwriter. Mention of the inquest had been sufficient to send him on television to moralize about Senator Kennedy's predicament. Here's the quote that he gave. As Senator Kennedy himself has declared, his conduct that night was inexplicable. He should have gone and gotten help that night. Now that he looks back on it, of course he should have. Sorensen was protecting himself in case the inquest did uncover any deception that he wasn't aware of. He had helped with the speech. He had been a part of the Kennedy compound goings on, but he did not want to be on the hook if there was deception involved, if there was something that the inquest found. So this shows that he's not confident in what Kennedy has said or what was done that night. He says, though, to the best of my knowledge, there are no misstatement of facts. Ted Kennedy was so young at this point that he could run for president even into the 80s if he wished to. In 1988, he would have been 56 years old. But at this point, no one can now predict what his political future would be. Everybody felt that whatever happens at the inquest is what will decide whether or not Kennedy could ever run for president. Sorensen had, up to this point, been thinking of running for office. But at this point, drafting Kennedy's speech had hurt his chances for his own candidacy. And Sorensen denies later that the accident at Chappaquiddick marked the end of the Kennedy era. But the truth is that from that point on, he changes a book he had written to kind of diminish Teddy Kennedy's role in anything that he writes, and he just focuses in on the two primary Kennedys, JFK and RFK, and says very little about Ted. And so he essentially wrote out Ted Kennedy from his place in the Kennedy legacy that was going to be a part of this book that was set to publish. So Chappaquiddick is already tarnishing the luster of the Kennedy reputation. Sorensen wasn't alone in distancing himself. Others began to distance themselves. And this is so interesting. So the strain that Kennedy is feeling perhaps is most evident when he leaves Cape Cod early Sunday to greet President Nixon on his return from an 8-nation foreign policy tour at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington. Richard Nixon stops to shake Kennedy's hand and then invites him to the White House, receiving him with, quote, almost paternal sympathy. Nixon took Kennedy aside for a private 10-minute talk in the Oval Office. Nixon had experienced premature political burial himself and later achieved a remarkable comeback, so he wanted to encourage Ted. Nixon refused to say what he had told Senator Kennedy, but it's very interesting that he was giving encouragement to Ted. With the passage of weeks, a high degree of skepticism about the senator's explanation of the accident and his behavior afterward had produced a sharp drop in Kennedy's popularity. Polls are now showing that basically people are wondering whether or not Kennedy was drunk. Public perception showed that regardless, at this point, Kennedy's judgment has been proven to be untrustworthy, that during a moment of crisis, he was unreliable. And, quote, the public will continue to question his ability to make important decisions under pressure. Writer Robert Sherrill observes, if there is one aspect about the accident more mysterious than any other, it was that despite the damage done to his reputation, Kennedy refused to clear the air. Painful as his slippage in popularity and the raw jokes were, Kennedy apparently preferred that to making a full disclosure. Yeah, that's it precisely. That he's here in the crucible and he doesn't say, look, you guys, here's what really happened. At no point, not even to Joey Gargan or Ted Sorensen or all these insiders, they don't even hear what happened. And so at no point is anything being done to bring light and clarity. Instead, we're all just shrouded with competing details that cannot fit together. On Monday, August 4th, George Killen and Bernie Flynn arrived in Edgartown to begin their official investigation into Mary Jo's death. Arena says they wanted the names of my witnesses and copies of the reports and everything else. But George and Bernie did everything on their own. Well, Killen says Arena's investigation was practically worthless, that the case was as cold as Mary Jo Kopechne, or colder. A lot of leads had already dried up, and most of all, Killen regretted the decision to release the body without autopsy. Flynn says George was kicking his own ass about that. Every day he's saying, we should have done an autopsy. Flynn is amused by a sign on display behind the front desk of the Shiretown Inn. It says, please do not ask us to answer questions concerning the Kennedy accident. Thank you, the management. He had been besieged since he went on to corroborate a portion of the senator's broadcast, and Russell Peachy was now having second thoughts about his encounter with Ted Kennedy. This is interesting. What he said to the investigators was this, quote, he didn't look to me like a man who had just come downstairs to complain about noise. He was just standing there. He was fully dressed. I think he was wearing a jacket and slacks. Usually a man who just wants to complain about noise doesn't get up and get fully dressed to do it, especially at 2:25 in the morning. Reservations for 7 people of the Kennedy party had been made under the names John Driscoll and Joe Gargan for the regatta weekend. The room adjacent to Senator Kennedy's had been occupied by Ross Richards. Peachy describes Richards as a friend and sailing companion of Ted. So, we're going to get into Ross Richards in the next chapter, but the end of chapter 37 is, and these are the observations, Gargan indicates that Ted feels this difficulty, that his 2 previous statements contradicted one another and had also not been under oath. And now he's looking at the prospect of being put under oath. Ted arranges for and pays for a lawyer for all of the party attendees. Former Kennedy men are now not as quick to come around now that an inquest is being discussed. And in fact, some of them are actively distancing themselves or making comments about their concerns. Ted Sorensen in particular makes that TV statement criticizing Ted's inexplicable decisions. Ted is being slowly erased from that Kennedy political heritage. The public is clearly concerned about Ted's judgment. And Flynn and Killen begin their investigation, and they realize that Arena's, quote, investigation was practically worthless to them. That's chapter 37. Chapter 38. Killen dispatched John Dunn to go and interrogate Ross Richards, and later came to regret that he did. Ross Richards was a vice president for the Narragansett Wire Company. He was a hard-driving, dynamic sportsman, and he had photographs with him and Ted on display in his living room, but now his feelings about the senator were ambivalent. Marilyn Richards, his wife, said, and remember, she's the one who was on the porch visiting that morning, so both Marilyn and Ross observed Ted the morning after the accident. Ross wasn't a member of the inner circle around Ted because he wasn't a political person. We were strictly sailing friends. We weren't close. Ross had grown up in Hyannisport. He and Ted had sailed against each other for years. So she said, we thought they were fun. We had a lot of glamour and fun around them, but we didn't know them very well. Richards was wary of talking to the police. He had heard no disturbance from the room, And his conversation with Ted the next morning had been about the previous day's regatta. He said, I happened to win the race, and he congratulated me on it. And we discussed that back and forth for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Richards had observed nothing out of the ordinary. Kennedy had not mentioned the accident. He says, I remember the bell at 8 o'clock. We asked the senator if he would like to have breakfast with us. He said he couldn't, but he might join us later. Kennedy had looked startled when Paul Markham and Joe Gargan showed up, quote, soaking wet. The three men went into the senator's room, and Richards heard an argument going on, but as to what it was about, I don't know. To me, these are the details that make it seem like he had no idea that an accident had happened. I don't know if what we're seeing here is evidence that he thought they would have taken care of it somehow, and he's shocked that they didn't, or that he had no idea it had happened and he's just finding out. But whatever the case, Ross Richards is saying he looked startled when they showed up and there's an argument. Dunn, this investigator who's been sent down to ask questions of Ross Richards, says, are you thinking what I'm thinking? That Kennedy was finding out about the accident for the first time? According to the report of the interrogation that Dunn submitted, Richards replied, it sure looked that way. So we have a first-hand account of Ross Richards the morning after the accident saying it looked like he was just finding out about it. Now, did Dunn ask a leading question and Richards goes along with it, or was that what Richards would have said without any leading? We don't know. Richards refused to discuss how much Ted Kennedy had to drink at the victory party on the boat after the regatta race, and Stan Moore would not give any indication about that either. He says, when Killen came to his automobile agency to interrogate him, Moore, who was there also that morning, said, the police asked me if the senator seemed nervous when I saw him on Saturday, and all I can say is he looked all right to me. He had made some innocuous marks, things like, what a beautiful day. Isn't this a lovely place? He didn't mention Chappaquiddick at all. Moore refused to discuss the drinking. I was asked that question many, many times, but I have no comment. I didn't think it was anybody's business. Ted had had 3 rum and cokes in about 20 minutes, but he wasn't laced or anything. Killen added both Moore and Richards to a list of witnesses that should be called at the inquest, but he's baffled by the reports of Senator Kennedy's conduct on the porch of the Shiretown Inn on the morning after the accident. And Bernie Flynn is also. And you remember, Bernie Flynn is the one who gave us many episodes ago, I want to say around episode, say, 5 or 6. So you remember Bernie Flynn's theory was essentially he had walked the island and he said, essentially, they're sitting there probably making out. They want to be together or whatever. And then Huck Look spies their car. And so Ted Kennedy takes off like a thunderbolt, isn't paying attention to where he's going. He's just trying to get away from the police officer because he was drunk. He knows it. But not only that, he's a senator who's who's in a car with a young woman that he wants to go to bed with. And so he is just trying to get away from the scene of Huck Look having seen him. And that's when he goes off the bridge. Somehow he gets out of the car, and that's the end of it. That's Bernie Flynn's theory previously. And that was given to us in chapter 15. Well, now, here is what his new revised theory is. He takes into account all the probable events that he knows about. And this is what he says. After fleeing from his encounter with the deputy sheriff down Dyke Road, Kennedy had decided not to chance getting arrested for drunk driving, Flynn suggested. So he pulled over. He got out of the car and tells the girl to go down to the end of the road and to come back to pick him up when the coast is clear. When she didn't show up, he thought she was stuck in the sand or got on the beach or got lost. And he thinks, well, I'll just go back to the cottage. He tells Gargan and Markham what happened and asks to be taken to the landing. When he gets there, the ferry's already closed down, and he thinks, what the hell, I'll just go back to the other side. He dives in and swims across. The people at the party hung around at the cottage waiting for Mary Jo to come back with Kennedy's car. By the time they realize she's missing, they go looking for her. That's why everybody spent the night out there. It wasn't until morning that Gargan and Markham even spot the car in the pond. They dive in to see if Mary Jo's in it, but they can't see anything. So they get on the ferry soaking wet, and run like hell to the Shiretown Inn to tell Ted what happened. That's the first time he hears about the accident. So that's Bernie Flynn's revised theory. I just want to say, both times I walk away feeling Bernie Flynn has his finger on the pulse of investigative details. And each time I've thought, that seems really probable, given the information that we have at the moment. So Bernie Flynn definitely has that investigator's mindset, and he is taking details and facts and compiling them into a credible theory of what could have happened. So right now, the best mind that we've seen on this case with the best investigative properties has come to this conclusion. Flynn says, I just can't believe that Kennedy went to sleep, got up the next morning, and was standing on deck supposedly preparing to go yachting, talking to people about the weather like nothing was going to happen, if he knew the girl was dead. You would stay in your damn hotel room. You'd be biting your fingernails, trying to figure out, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? Who's going to find out? When are they going to do it? You'd be expecting to be locked up any minute, and you'd be frightened. As Flynn visualized the scene, Kennedy is talking to these people when Gargan and Markham show up. I think he received the information like, Ted, the car is in the water. And he gets this startled look. Then the three of them go into his room to discuss it. When they come out, Kennedy is shaken. This reaffirms my suspicion that this is the first time he knows the girl didn't make it back to the cottage. Kennedy's first impulse was to go to the scene of the accident to see for himself what had happened. He said, not because of the telephones, not to make the call. Remember how we were told that whole story about they decided not to use any of the phones on the island because there's long lines because it's the regatta. He said, none of that. That's not why they went. He says, there's no reason whatsoever for him to go to Chappaquiddick if he knew about the accident. What's he going to do? Look at the body and say, oh my God, she did stay in the car. She didn't get out? Flynn could only surmise why Kennedy had given an altogether different version of the accident in his report. He says, not unless somebody said to him, we could make you look like a hero. You dove in, you tried to save her. That could sound pretty damn good. He says, they didn't realize how much this situation would mushroom. Everybody just thinks it's a simple automobile accident. They just wanted to protect him from an embarrassing situation, being drunk in a car with a girl late at night, parked on the road to the cemetery. That would account for the time difference with Huck. Look, if anything happened, it didn't happen on the beach. It had already happened. Kennedy's finished, and now he's ready to run. Well, once he had made the police report, though, once he had put himself on the line, now he's got to stick with the story. It's like you've made your bed and you got to lie in it. This is the story you told. This is the one you got to keep telling. Killen says that's why the details about the accident are so sketchy. Kennedy doesn't actually know what happened. That's why I was so vague in the first telling. Police had no hope of questioning Gargan or anybody else who had attended the party. Now everybody is represented by counsel, and once somebody gets a lawyer, you can't go to them and just say, I have some questions for you. You have to go to the attorney. So at this point, they're all suffering for Arena's lack of investigation in the beginning. Diniz had not received an answer to his request for an inquest yet, and Diniz suggests that another man, Quinn, take over. He's the Attorney General, Robert Quinn, in Boston. Quinn nearly fell out of his chair. He said, no, he was terrified. Although Diniz had brought up the subject, Quinn has no intent of becoming more involved in the Kennedy accident. Boyle wants to know if Diniz intended to submit evidence that an unlawful act or negligence caused or contributed to the death of Mary Jo. Diniz regards the response as satisfactory, and he thinks an inquest could begin in just a week or 10 days. He says, all I'm trying to do is just conduct a general inquiry into a situation that should be looked into a little further. He says, we want to learn as much as we can about the incident from the people who were in the area at the time so as to determine exactly what the facts are. As part of this inquest, Diniz announces that he wants to have Mary Jo Kopechne's body exhumed. Quote, in order to have a pathologist perform an examination and once and for all close that aspect of the case. Diniz had to prove in his own state that an autopsy was necessary, and there are some hurdles that he's going to have to get over for this. But All of them are operating in Massachusetts, but remember, she's now been buried in Pennsylvania. And so now we have people in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, thinking through what should be done in this circumstance. For Pennsylvania courts to grant exhumation, it should be shown that there were, quote, imperative reasons to disturb the sanctity of the grave, and the wishes of the deceased's family would be taken into account. Autopsies could be performed even with their opposition if there was a suspicion that a serious crime had occurred. So Diniz feels fairly confident that they're going to get an autopsy, but he had not talked to the Kopechnes about exhuming their daughter's body. He said, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to bother them. They have had enough trouble. This proves to be a bad decision because Gwen Capek makes a statement. Mr. Diniz never bothered to consult us. We've never heard a word. We've been left out of this as if it didn't matter who we are. She was under the impression that an autopsy had already been performed. We were told everything has been taken care of. I'm pretty sure it was somebody from Mr. Diniz's office. I don't know why in 2 weeks they decide to hold an autopsy. Maybe I'm a foolish person, but I just can't see this at all. Not after we buried her. Kennedy's aide, Dunn Gifford, he's the one, you remember, who shepherded the body around the island, made sure it was gone, and went and talked to the Kopechnes. So he had been familiar with the Kopechnes. She says he had paid us a number of visits. He had made a trip all the way to our home to tell us there was going to be something in the newspapers that might hurt us. We thought that was nice because then we were prepared for it. What Gifford wanted to prepare the Kopechnes for were 2 Anderson columns that were scheduled to appear in the Washington Post. And these were basically going to be a piecing together of various facts to try to figure out what had happened on the night of the accident. Some of the summary portions included things like that Senator Kennedy had done his share of drinking at the party, but people who were intimate with him insisted he was not drunk. He had invited Mary Jo for a midnight swim, deliberately turned onto Dyke Road, heading for East Beach, and hit the bridge going 20 miles per hour. After it was too late to save Mary Jo, he felt it still might be possible to save his presidential dream, Anderson wrote. Exhausted and in a panic, Kennedy had rested beside Poocha Pond. He would ask his cousin, Joe Gargan, to take the rap for him. Gargan had always been there when the Kennedys needed him. Although a lawyer, he was more a handyman who ran the errands and attended to arrangements for the Kennedys. Gargan agreed to say he had driven the car and returned to Dyke Bridge to familiarize himself with the scene of, quote, his accident. And then Anderson wrote, it is entirely possible that Markham and Gargan attempted to retrieve the girl's body. Then they rustled up a boat and delivered Kennedy to the other side. So this is what Anderson is proposing has been done, that they were going to go swim, they accidentally went in, Gargan and Markham do probably dive in, and that they get Ted across. It's interesting that they say that they rustled up a boat. That's another detail that didn't come initially through either of the statements and is showing up here as having been something pieced together from facts and from Kennedy intimates. So it makes you wonder, is that part of something that actually did happen and it's just kind of seeping its way out, or is this something where he's trying to piece together what happened? Publicly, Gargan denies that there's any truth in Anderson's columns. He says there is no basis in fact whatsoever for the report. It's entirely untrue. But Gargan was bothered by that Anderson had cited Kennedy intimates as sources. He suspected that misinformation about the accident probably had come from friends who were anxious to explain away the senator's misbehavior. The reports had trivialized Gargan's dangerous rescue effort, and he's particularly galled by this description of him as a handyman. It makes him angry. He thinks this reveals the sentiments of certain Kennedy folks about him. He made a living as a trial lawyer And his work in Kennedy campaigns had always been voluntary and unpaid. So he saw it as honorable work, and he realizes other people just see him as a handyman who runs errands for the Kennedys. The speculation that Gargan had agreed to take blame for the accident came to him from Time magazine, Anderson said later. Their files contained this same report. I can't say Time bought it because they didn't use it. So Time had the report that Gargan had agreed to take the fall for him, but they didn't end up printing it in their version. So he got it from them, but says, well, it could be called into question because they didn't end up using it in their report. The observations we have from chapter 38 are that Detective John Dunn interviews Ross Richards about the events from that morning, the 7:30 or so a.m. conversation that they had with Ted Kennedy. He observed Joey Gargan and Paul Markham soaking wet, confronting Ted Kennedy. All of this leads to Bernie Flynn's new theory that Ted Kennedy was not in the car, got out, had no idea about the accident at all until they show up. Diniz is now pursuing an autopsy, but Diniz fails to contact the Kopechnes, and so there's a fence between them, and there's now defensiveness and even potential obstacle from the Kopechnes. Anderson's newspaper surmisings are supposedly based on the words of Kennedy intimates, and so we're getting these reports that are now clouding the issue even more. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. I hope you're enjoying the book. Like I said, we are going to try to go through this at least a little faster than we have been. I don't know that I'll be able to do 3 episodes a week, but I am going to shoot for 2 so that we can move through the remainder of this book, which, like I said, this is all back matter. So it's about to there. So we have this much left, which is maybe we have 20% or so left. So that's encouraging. I hope to see you guys at the next episode. Let me know in the comments what you notice, what you think particularly about Bernie Flynn's new theory. I think that's the most interesting thing that happened through this. I think I sometimes lean towards that theory as being the most likely to carry with it all the varying details that we have. That or something like it must have been what happened, that he wasn't in the car, she went off. What I can't figure out, though, is what would make him put himself as the driver. That's where I still get hung up every time. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. We'll see you guys later. Bye.